one of the things I do, even with work with architecture, is I try and simplify the complex, right? Try and break it down to the fundamentals. So if you think about museums, just by definition, they're a Western social construct, right? They were institutions that were built to celebrate empire, to celebrate British imperialism and conquest, right? So if you try and understand what that means, you had these buildings which were erected, and then objects that were taken from faraway places by British soldiers, either as loot or as just, spoils of war, were now put in these buildings to celebrate the strength and the might and the glory of the empire.
Welcome back to another season of Third Culture Africans. I'm proud to say Africa's #1 award-winning career and entrepreneurship podcast, voted for by you at the African Podcast and Voice Awards. I am Zeze, your host. I'm obsessed with all things entrepreneurship, and our show is dedicated to igniting your entrepreneurial journey, sharing resources, and giving you the tools to pursue your dreams fearlessly. We celebrate artistry and stories from those brave enough to create something and succeed. Inspiring, motivating, and full of wonder, discover how those who succeed do it. Your support helps make this show bigger and better. Please leave a review on Apple Podcasts and join our community with weekly newsletters curated just for you. Let's connect on Instagram and Facebook at Third Culture Africans. Sit back, relax, and let's do this. Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of Third Culture Africans. On this week's episode, we've got Seun Oduwole. So,
Hello.
Just a little intro to this episode, which is different from what we normally would do. But Seun and I actually have recorded this episode before. Unfortunately, the powers that be when it comes to technology, we ended up only with Seun's track of audio and not mine. But it's been a good few months since we spoke, and I thought it would be great to, in theory, the point of this show is to capture people in their meantime, not at the end of the journey when, you can look back with great hindsight and explain your journey to achieving. So we recorded before the John Randle Centre for Yoruba Culture and History had actually launched and the project was finished. This episode is now being recorded months after the project actually has launched. So there's hindsight into how it's been received, etc., etc. And I think it will be fun for us to be able to stitch in, I guess, some of the before and after answers from that recording, because I think it will be a great representation of the journey during, the journey post, and then where you are at now. We're trying something new, guys. So hopefully if you like what you hear and how this episode evolves over your listen, let us know. Social media, email, a contact form on the website. It will perhaps maybe create a new dimension to some episodes where we could go back and revisit with some of our past guests and have sort of the after story. But without further ado, this week's guest is Seun Oduwole. He's an architect. He's the lead principal at SI.SA with an appetite for innovation, Nottingham University graduate, and has created what will be for our generation the architectural language project of this decade in Nigeria through the John Randle Centre for Yoruba Culture and History. And there's so much more that we can throw in. So thanks, Seun, for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Second time, right?
Yes.
I feel like
do it twice.
I feel like we've talked so much,
I know.
and I feel like I'm conscious that I don't want to miss some parts of your story because I feel like we have it.
Okay.
But I would love to kind of insert, I guess, your early journey from our
Mm-hmm.
early recordings round about here. So
Mm-hmm.
if you guys can sit back, take a listen, Seun explain sort of his journey into architecture and where he is now.
Okay, it starts, I don't know. I think it actually starts from my granddad. So my granddad's a scholar, or was a scholar, and a Baptist minister. So he's very studious. Yeah, had a massive library, and that was one of my sort of favorite childhood memories, just going into his library and just getting lost in books. And it was how you walk into you see a Harry Potter movie, you just see those books. So he had them all: Grimm's fairy tales, Andersen's fairy tales, Black Beauty, Hansel and Gretel, and he, I'd read them. He'd tell me lots of stories, and then there were lots of Yoruba stories as well. That he just, he was just this font of knowledge and storytelling and creativity. So you can imagine as a sort of 6, 7 year old just disappearing into books and that shaping your imagination at a very young age. So I mean, I realized very quickly that I'm very right brained, very creative. I was very good at art. My dad's an architect as well. So it was almost like a path that I had no choice but to follow. you know. So I actually went to university in Nigeria for 3 years. I went to University of Nigeria in Enugu. I went there at 16. There's a very weird backstory behind there. Very weird backstory. I kind of half of it was a blur, if I'm honest. But I was there, learned some stuff. Oh well, I was there, and I vaguely remember some sort of education during my 3 years there. But there were lots of strikes, so I was at home half the time. So I went to Nottingham University. So I mean, by that time, I honed my technical skills at least a bit more than a fresher, than a first year university student would have. Architecture. Yes, yeah. So I went, and it's, yeah, I think 18 at the right age. So I was good technically. I could draw very well, but what was a shock to me was the more theoretical, philosophical side of architecture, which is taught in the West, but um, it's not taught, or it wasn't taught in Nigerian universities. So that was a big hit to my system, because I had to learn. I had to go back to reading to understand, yeah, and I had to immerse myself in history, art history, architecture history, philosophy, styles, architecture philosophies, but then also English literature. There was just so much of it, and so it took me a while to get used to that. I really struggled, and it really hit my confidence. Because same as you, I thought, yeah, I know what I'm good at. Um, I can draw very well. I'm really, really creative. I can come up with really crazy ideas. I couldn't explain my ideas. I couldn't articulate my thoughts, and so that really dented my confidence, and it really affected, at least my first year through uni. Spoke to some people, and yeah, I identified what the problems were. I knew I was quite weak on architecture theory, so I spent summers just catching up, just reading, just going to the start, man. Plato, Socrates, Kant, and people think, what does that have to do with architecture? But I graduated, and I couldn't get a job. And I remember sending out CV after CV, must have sent out 30 CVs, man. Couldn't get a job. Spoke to one of my tutors, who, I mean, it was a funny story because I was aiming for, sort of, call it your tier two firms, your B firms, and he said, "Look, man, just shoot for the top." tried the A guys. I remember looking at the guy like, this guy, you just want to kill my confidence completely, Sha. I can't get with the B guys. You want me to try the A guys? And he's like, look, what's what's the worst that could happen? You get 5, 6 more no's. And long story short, I got an interview with one of the biggest firms in the UK at the time, Hopkins and Partners, and I got a slot. And that that changed. I think that was when everything changed, because I went there and I was thinking to myself, oh my God, I'm in one of the big 4, 5 firms, you know, and walked in, and the thing with architecture is you're usually the only black face in any sort of firm or meeting you go to. So I walked in there, very intimidated. I remember my line director, he read it, and he just sort of put me at ease, told me not to worry, introduced me to everybody, top to bottom, directors, the tea lady, everyone. My portfolio spoke to them because my work has always been very strong, right from primary school. Um, but I didn't have confidence in the work because I realized I just couldn't, when we had crits where we had to defend our work, I get so nervous because I couldn't find the words to explain and convey my thoughts, and I'd freeze and I'd start to stammer, and that would be the difference between maybe like an A minus and a C plus. I mean, by the time I left, I was comfortable. I was getting in at 7 o'clock myself. I'm waking up at 5. I can't wait to get into the office. I'm going to crits presentations with them. I'm seeing how they command the room. They give me little tips on how to talk, how to present, and then I'm going back as well and doubling up on my reading, just doubling up on my literature, doubling up on just anything I can get. I became, because I'd also built that skill early, learning how to read and learning how to understand. This was like the final piece of the puzzle where I was able to now take that understanding and express it, find the words, find the vocabulary, and then have the confidence to say, okay, to sell the idea. So by the time I went back for my master's, I was a completely different person.
Great. So back to present day. Architectural Digest
Yes.
has called you the man leading the charge in the next wave of design on the continent.
Oof, high praise.
Hey, big
And
time.
pressure. And
Big
pressure.
time.
As
Big
in,
time.
I need to cut that out and frame it.
Big time. How are you feeling today now that we've heard about your journey thus far? How are you feeling today now that the project is live, it is tangible, people are walking in the building, using the space, and all of the press that's come with it? You've had international press, local press, all sorts of press.
Yeah, it's surreal. But okay, I'm going to make a slight confession. It's not open to the public yet. But we've been doing private tours. We're
Yes.
95% of the way there. So I know there's been a lot of media, the videos that have gone round.
Presidents,
Yeah.
plenty
Okay.
big
Let me
people
let
have
me let
come
me let me
now.
let me cast Zeze. That thing was rub and shine.
It wasn't.
That thing was rub and shine, man. But they needed, rub and shine before the main bath.
Yeah.
So the main bath hopefully should be sometime before the end of the year. But we've had lots of people come through. It's like I said, it's 95% of the way done. We've got maybe 7 empty showcases. And that's just because the objects to go in those showcases are coming from the British Museum, Pitt Rivers, and one other international museum. So we need to sort of cross T's, dot I's, and sort of legal partnership agreement frameworks before those objects now get shipped back to Lagos.
Okay,
But other than that,
pause. That you're just giving us. This is a very good name dropping, but British Museum, who and
yeah.
who?
Pitt Rivers
Pete
Museum in
Rivers.
Oxford. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Pitt, Pitt. Yeah.
Okay.
And there's one that we're still talking to, which at Fowler Museum in California.
So let's put this into context. You
Mhm.
are waiting for artifacts that very much belong to Nigeria, that have been for centuries living in other people's spaces. Now, in the press recently, there's been talk about that, right? There's been
You're throwing me straight into this restitution argument.
wait.
I'm giving out a hard pass, man. Handbrake U-turn.
Wait now. So we've heard about how the project came to light, because we are about to insert it here.
So, Randle Centre, my perfect project. It would be this. Like if someone sat me down as a student and say, just write your perfect brief, it would be this. Because it's the opportunity to sort of test all the thoughts and ideas that I've accumulated over the 20 years that I've been working, and try bring it to life, you know. But I mean, the very start of this, there's sort of there are about three different starts to the project. So let me start with my own start, and then or let me talk about my own start, and then how the project really came to life. So I've got this group, right, um, of other architects. There's myself, Papa, Omotai, and Tosin Oshino. And we once in a while we come together and sort of just exchange ideas and just talk about architecture, urbanism, and um, how we can improve the quality of architecture through the work that we do, or through mentoring young architects, or or teaching, or just talking about our experiences. Um, so I think it was in 2015 or 2016, we held a program at the British Council looking at interstitial spaces, which is um, leftover spaces in urban areas and how they get underdeveloped. So under bridges, or those little sort of plots of land between a road and a housing area. These spaces that now get neglected, and you get gangs, druggies, or just where people go lay about. And so we did a study, and then I was also doing another study about Lagos, and Lagos during the rainy season, and why it always floods, right? Um, which is one, because we're too close to sea level, and a lot of the green space has been built over, so the water can't go into the ground, and we don't have a proper established drainage network, right? So these two exercises were running in tandem. So during those studies, um, we in the office, we came up with this idea of um, trying to create public interventions. So Papa worked on this project, which turned the underside of Fallamore Bridge into a usable space, and he worked with an artist called Polly Alakija. So if you go there now, they've turned it into a really nice space. So some events are held there. Kids play football. There's paintings of the Chibok girls on the columns of the bridge, um, and we thought came up with this idea of sort of trying to recreate a green space, swimming pool space, somewhere in Lagos. And then I met someone who had a conversation with, who now mentioned that the governor, the Lagos state government, were thinking of a new museum, right? And then as part of that conversation, I was told, "Oh, do you realize there's an old swimming pool somewhere in Lagos Island?" And I'm like, "Really?" So went to look at the swimming pool, took pictures. So went there, took pictures, and sort of put together a proposal to renovate the swimming pool. It was completely boarded off. So it was on J.K. Randall Road. You drive past it, you won't even know there's a swimming pool there. So we got in, we snuck in, took our pictures, went back to the office, did a model, and then put it together and handed it over. Gave it to this person, who passed it on to someone in Lagos State government. And then we got a call back. saying we should turn up at the sites. So we went to the sites. We were just sort of standing there casually, and then the governor turned up. So governor turned up, and then we told him about the idea, and he was like, "Oh yeah, yeah, okay, like it, like it." And so we were excited. Uh, we went away thinking, okay, well, this is we can renovate this. And then we got a call back saying, oh, um they needed another building. Um, and I said, what do you mean you need another building? Because there was a hall, there was a memorial hall next to the swimming pool, that was demolished, and there was an uproar. So we were called and said, okay, we need a design to replace that memorial hall. I'm like, okay, what do you need? uh, and so there was an idea of something, but there wasn't really a brief. So we said, okay, fine, we'll go away, because they said, oh, we want a museum. I'm like, why? There's a museum right across the road. The National Museum's right across the road. But I said, you know what? I went back to the office and said, guys, okay, let's think about this. Let's sit down. I'd When we were looking at that swimming pool, I'd done some research, because the first question is, why is there a swimming pool here? And how come nobody knows about it? So I went and spoke to my dad, spoke to a few of my uncles, tried to get as much information as possible. That was when I found out about Dr. John Randle, right? So Dr. John Randle was born in Sierra Leone. His grandmother was Sarah Forbes Bonetta, who I think was Queen Victoria's, who was gifted as a slave to Queen Victoria, but got adopted. So she was Queen Victoria's goddaughter, right? So he he schooled in the UK, came back to Nigeria, set up a surgery on the Marina, um, at the turn of the 19th century, and there was a jetty in front of his surgery. So little kids used to go there, play. Boats used to take off from there to Ikorodu, Badagry, and if there were any accidents and people drowned, those corpses would wash up to the front of his surgery. Bit morbid. So he went to the government house. He went to the state house, to the colonial government house at the time, and said, "Look, can you guys build a pool so that these kids and other Lagosians can learn how to swim?" And they said no. So all of Onikan around that time was a park called King George V Park. So think Kensington Park, right? Just big, large, expanse park. Tafawa Balewa Square was the race course. It was, there were tennis courts. Lagos Lawn Tennis Court, where Lagos Lawn Tennis Court is now, were, actual proper lawn tennis courts. So that entire area was a park with tennis courts, with a race course. And so they said to him, we won't build the pool, but you're happy to build it, if you want. So he built the pool in the park with his own money in 1928. And so obviously it became a big attraction, big recreational space. Lots of Lagosians at the time swam in there. And then he passed away, his son took it over. And I think his son passed away in 1952 or 53 or so. Then five of his son's friends came together, set up a trust to look after the pool, right? So that kept going. And then I think sometime in 1956, Tafawa Balewa now gave them the plot of land right next to the swimming pool, and they built a hall in memory of J.K. Randall, who was the son of Dr. Randall. So that hall became another nucleus, but for creatives. So Cyprian Quincy, Wale Soyinka, there were a lot of theater performances, poetry readings. It became, think, like the current Freedom Park. So that was the main sort of cultural nucleus of Lagos Island, right? So you had the swimming pool, and then you had the performance hall in the park, and that worked. That was available to the public until the 70s, sometime in the 70s, 76 or 77, when the military came, and it it just sort of went into disrepair. And then fast forward to 2006, when we got involved. So I thought, you know what? There's a strong memory of the city here, and a lot of, and a lot of history. So why don't we try and recreate that? Why don't we try and bring that back? So we renovate the swimming pool, and rather than have this just a performance hall, we try and create a community space, a community center at a larger scale, right? And then we have additional recreational facilities, restaurants, breakout spaces, and then we landscape the entire area, try and put back as much of that King George V Park space that was there. So that's the summary of the brief that we created.
Okay, so back to present day.
Yes.
We're wanting to, or I am wanting to talk about a little bit about the journey in broaching that conversation about, hey, I've built this structure. Here is what it means to the people. And I would love to have X, Y, and Z pieces. Where does that conversation begin? So not necessarily starting the political debate about around restitution, but how do you go about having that? Because you're just a in your own words, a regular guy who had a vision, who wanted to create something that outlived you. Right now, where does a regular guy begin to have discussions with the British Museum and navigating the restitution portion of things without
stepping on toes?
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So for me, it was very simple. One of the things I do, even with work with architecture, is I try and simplify the complex, right? Try and break it down to the fundamentals. So if you think about museums, just by definition, they're a Western social construct, right? They were institutions that were built to celebrate empire, to celebrate British imperialism and conquest, right? So if you try and understand what that means, you had these buildings which were erected, and then objects that were taken from faraway places by British soldiers, either as loot or as just, spoils of war, were now put in these buildings to celebrate the strength and the might and the glory of the empire, right? So that the locals can come and see what the natives and savages from faraway places did in their spare time, or trinkets, that sort of thing. And so if you now sort of put that within our context, the National Museum, which is right opposite our building, was built in 1957 by Bill Fagg and Kenneth Murray, and I think they got a bursary from the British government. They erected the building. They went round the country and bought a number of objects, quite a lot of objects. They bought them in pairs. So one half they used to fill the National Museum. The other half they actually took to the British Museum. So right from the start, you could already sort of trace the provenance of a number of objects that went from here to the British Museum. So that's, number one. And then number two, most of us who grew up in Lagos have been to their museum at one time or another. And, there's a disconnect. It doesn't quite work. Yes, it's informative, but there's no context. There isn't much context to the exhibition. So, and I remember, I don't know how old I was, 8, 9. I was always struck by how, alien it felt, how academic it felt, how divorced, or how unmoved I was, and then, I mean, I come from a family of art people, so did quite a few visits when I was younger: Paris, the Louvre, the BM, the British Museum as well. And going into these places and just them being very quiet, very static, very solemn, very contemplative spaces. And then in a corner somewhere, there's the Africa collection where, East, West, Nupe, Yoruba, Nok, Kanuri,
everything
Benin,
is
everything's just kind of jumbled together.
It's just one. It's
there.
One conquest story, basically.
Yeah. So when this opportunity came along, for me personally, it was an opportunity to interrogate this idea of museology, right, and the entire Western paradigm, to say, look, this is a space that we're now going to situate in Lagos, in Onikan, which is the cultural heartbeat of Lagos Island, right? And there's a lot of history that surrounds it, from the State House, which was built by the British government, was the colonial seat of power. Island Club, which was the first private members club that wasn't open to Nigerians. And then you had, and then Lagos Lawn Tennis Club, the same. And then Yoruba Tennis Club was set by Herbert Macaulay, and so on and so forth.
So you talked about, I guess, the history of the site when we last spoke. So we're going to just throw that in here just so that in present day listeners can catch up.
All the spaces around Onikan. So you have the National Museum across the street, which is built in 1957. The other side of the fence from us is Island Club, which was the first private members club. Then across the road, so locals were not allowed into Island Club. So Yoruba Tennis Club was set up by indigents, Herbert Macaulay, Katie Ajas, and a few other people. So there's a lot of history there as to why these buildings were there. Then the race course became Tafawa Balewa Square. Freedom Park was an old prison. And then further down Broad Street, you have CBAC, which is the Center for Black African Arts and Culture, which is where all the documentation for Festac 77 is kept. So we looked at all of that and we thought, okay, there's a lot of history that's tied to sort of Yoruba heritage around this area. So how do we pull from that and make that part of the subject matter, which was why we came up with this idea to have the community space and then also an exhibition floor that tells that sort of narrative. So that tells that Yoruba story, and also so that becomes like an exhibition space at a higher level. Then at a lower level, we now have these additional facilities. So there's press rooms, there's seminar rooms, there's conference room, there's an online library, there's a temporary exhibition space. So it becomes a daily use space. It becomes a multi-use, space that sits in this park.
Okay, so we're back.
So for me, it was very simply, okay, how do we sort of deconstruct this whole idea of Western museology, right? Which decontextualized objects of Yoruba or African origin, if you want to call them that. And then if you focus and then put the focus back on the objects, but not just on the objects, but the provenance, the storyline, and the fact that they weren't just objects. They had a significance, whether it was religious, spiritual, cultural, daily function, or whatever, and because most of them were carvings, or they were sculptures, or they were bronzes, and they were made for a purpose by somebody for somebody within a certain context, within a certain framework. So how do we recontextualize not just the objects, but the narrative around how they came to be, and the social system that led to their creation, right? And then sort of zoom out and look at the wider historical framework, looking at the culture, the heritage, almost sort of from the origin point. So because those objects relate to a point in space and time, right? But before the creation of that actual object at that point in space, at that point in time, there was a system, there was a social system, there was a hierarchy. There were people, they lived within a certain kind of order, within a certain framework, and they, this was what they did, this was how they did, and this is how these objects came to be. So the narrative, we're almost sort of humanizing the story that created these objects.
Well, we're telling it from a non-colonial lens, right?
Exactly. Completely decolonized lens. I know that word is very sort of popular at the moment, and I try and shy away from it.
Let's use it, please. It will help us with SEO.
Fair.
So when people are searching for references, best come here, please. We've got the true Lolo over here.
Yeah. But you see, the thing is, for me personally, I think the word decolonize still centers the colonizer.
Yeah. It does.
You know what I mean? So,
but
yeah,
it's the true story.
for the purposes of, yeah. So it's saying, okay, how do we sort of reconstruct this typology, right?
Well, how do we tell the story for ourselves, by ourselves, right?
Exactly, celebrating ourselves. Exactly. So that's what it was. Or so that was where my head was.
So where do you start the conversation though? Do you just pick up the phone? Hello, British Museum. I'm just this guy with this.
I literally walked in.
Oh wow.
I literally just walked in. So we designed the building, and it was just a shell. So in conversation with my clients, I said to them that, sir, sure, when we're done, like, your building will be empty. And he was like, eh.
We got to put stuff in it.
We need some stuff, man. Yeah. It was like, okay, so how do we go about it? I said, well, we need content, right? And apart from content, we need the infrastructure. So I use the library analogy. Say you want to build a library, you need the building, obviously, right? And then you need the books. But a library would have more than just books. You'd have maybe maps, manuscripts. And then you need bookshelves, because you can't just put your books on the floor, right? So you need bookshelves, you need computers, you need hangers, and so on and so forth. So coming back to our space, we had the shell, and then we needed content, right? Which wasn't just limited to objects or artifacts. And then we needed the actual museum infrastructure. So glass cases, projectors, graphic panels, so on and so forth. The list is endless. And then, because in this context, we were the one thing I was adamant about, there were two things. One, I wanted it to be an unapologetically Yoruba space. So Yoruba would be primary language, English subtitles. Right?
Oh, wow.
That was number one. Yeah. And then number two, I wanted it to be a completely immersive space that was sort of typical of a Lagos environment, because I guess that's what people are most familiar with. So, because when you think Lagos, you think energy, you think chaos, you think vibrancy. If you're being positive, you think noise, you think smell, and then when you think about different experiences in Lagos. So if you go for an Owambe, for example, or for a wedding, it's just a clash of colors, noise, vibrancy, swag, money flying everywhere, food smells, champagne. There's just an energy. There's just a vibe. There's just a vibrancy, and which for me is it characterizes Lagos, and by extension the rest of Nigeria. Do you understand? Because if you go to Abuja, if you go to Kano, if you go to Enugu, it's just a sort of different interpretation of that energy, right? But so I wanted to capture that energy where you walk into that space, that you're not in a Western museum, right? That you're so a lot of elements that make up that system, we were going against. So the first thing I wanted to do was have a soundscape from start to finish. Noise everywhere, if you want to call it that.
The African trademark, oversensitized.
Do you understand?
Yeah.
And so, because I remember the first conversations with our exhibition designers, they were like, "No, that's too much. It's too much sound." I'm like, "No. Like, have you guys been to Lagos? Like, you need to come to Lagos, sort of thing."
You are assaulted by noise.
Yes, exactly.
You are assaulted by it.
Exactly. Then number two, I want a color everywhere. Almost like a sort of wedding. You have bride's color here, groom's color here.
Again,
people are clashing the two.
You're assaulted by all the senses.
Your sensory overload. Yep. The jollof rice wafting past your nostrils. All of that. It's a complete multi-sensory experience. Which was a bit of a challenge, because I had to build a team of people who were experts in museology, especially Western museology, and had to now try and explain to them that, look, guys, we need to sort of break this down, right? And thankfully, I had some professors, Professor Abiodun, especially Roland Abiodun, who wrote this book called Yoruba Art and Language, which looked at Yoruba heritage and language from a philosophical thought perspective. I'll come into that later on. But he was sort of instrumental. But going back to the institutions, like I literally just walked into the BM one day, man.
Pitch in hand or just?
She understand? Pitch in hand, though. I was like, I went into the reception. I said, hello, hi.
Excuse me.
Excuse me. Can I speak to somebody, curator for Africa?
Yeah.
You know, they're like, who do you represent? I looked at her like, what do you mean?
I am me.
I am me. I am him.
And me is I.
She understand? Like, what kind of question is that?
Yeah. You know, people underestimate the power of just trying.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I didn't get very far
to
summarize that story. I actually got nowhere.
But at least you know that they'll probably at least you probably got the name of the person who probably.
I said I didn't get kobo.
They didn't give you anything?
Zero, man.
Oh my God. Zero. Okay, so how did you do it?
So there was a friend of mine, Sonia, who is also working on another museum project. So I think he'd come across these exhibition designers called Ralph Applebaum Associates, and they're like the daddy of museum designers. I mean, they did the Queen's Crown Jewels. I think they did the Jewish Museum. They did the African American History Museum in Washington. They're doing Obama's Presidential Library. Like, they're literally the daddy of museums. So I sent them an email telling them, man, come on, I'm doing this museum. I need exhibition designers. Can we have a chat? I went into their office with a set of my drawings.
As you do.
And as you do.
Ignorance is bliss.
Yeah, man. Well, I mean, yeah. So, and the guy looked at me, Phil. Phil is my besto now, but this was back in 2016. And he looked at me, he says, you know, who's my client? I said, Lagos State Government. He said, do you have a contract with your client? I went, nope. You know, he said, well, this will cost you quite a lot. You know, I said, how much? You know, I said, give me an invoice.
Yeah.
You know? So I told him to give me a minute. I went to the site, called my commissioner. I said, look, man, I need this. So are you good for the money? The guy was like, of course not. Like, what do you think this is? I said, okay, and can I add this money to the project cost? And he was like, dude, yeah, whatever, man. You don't even have an agreement. Why are you asking me for project cost?
Yeah.
So he said, yeah, fine, whatever. You know, like sort of very dismissively. So I went back to Phil and I said, yeah, all right, let's do it. And he was like, do you have the money? I was like, no, but I'll get it. And the guy was just looking at me like, is this guy mad?
Pompous young man.
Or is this guy...
Pompous young man.
Like, you're either mad or just foolish.
Yeah.
You know? And so I just said to myself, look, man, you don't shoot. So I have this saying, you don't shoot, you don't store.
Yeah, go big or
you
go
don't shoot,
home.
You don't score. Go big or go home, man. So I was just, you know, he just looked at me and he said, and you came with your drawings. I went, yeah, because, you know, I thought maybe you might have a look and give me some tips.
You guys thinking, do you know how much I charge for this kind of consulting work?
like 200 an hour. So the guy just said, you know what? Do you think you can make this work? I said, yeah. I said, I've worked on this for about 6.5 months. I wouldn't do this if I didn't think it was possible. He says, but you don't have an agreement. I went, yeah, it'll come. So the guy just said, all right, fine, man, let's look at it. Sat there and just reworked the entire interior and sent me the agreement. I signed it. They worked for I think it was about 1.5 years before we even got to the point where we had an agreement and I got paid and I could pay them. So it was a complete leap of faith, right? But once I had Phil on, you know, then I had my credible Oyinbo guy. Do you get? So which works wonders. So I went back to the British Museum with my Oyinbo guy because Phil knew the curator for Africa. Yeah, so we went back there. You know, he'd sort of written like a little, you know, synopsis, and so we had a meeting with them, and they were like, "Okay, yeah, interesting. Come back when you actually have a contract, and maybe when you're building." So fast forward through Phil, and in that time I'd spoken to over a dozen. Because okay, so I realized that I'd done the building. I had my exhibition designer, but we didn't have a narrative. We had no intellectual base.
So one of the questions I asked in our previous recording was around, how many people does it take to build such a large project, making the dream come true, and how do you decide what direction or materials to use? So we're just going to throw in those answers here because I think it'll give context to you feeling your way through what then becomes your team and how you navigated your choice in materials, etc.
Yeah, I mean, it started with just my team, with just my architecture team. What was very clear to me very early on, sat around the table talking to the guys, listening to the client, they, I knew what we needed to do because for me, every project's an opportunity, and I think it's very easy to miss and it's very easy to get it wrong, especially if your aspirations are sort of quite low, right? So for me, this was a once in a lifetime opportunity because my client's the Lagos state government, right? And anywhere in the world, talk less of Nigeria, if you want to build public institutions or if you want to build any sort of entity to serve the public, government are the only organization that can do that at scale. Private sector cannot do it, right? And the last museum was built, the National Museum was built in 1957 by the British government. It was funded by the British government. You know what I mean? So outside, and then, realizing very quickly that this could be the single largest um, cultural event since Festac if if we do this properly, and especially with the subject, we'd done all this research and we knew that we could create, there was an opportunity to create something special, so we just had to try and sell it. So straight off, I mean, we did our fancy ideas. We used sort of Yoruba culture as, visual metaphors. It was very adamant that we had, the building would come out the ground. I wanted to replant as much of the park as possible. So I didn't want this big white modernist box that would be sort of sat in the middle of the site. I wanted the building to be part of the site, to come from the site, to blend with the site. You know what I mean? So that was what informed our green roof. So the building itself becomes an extension of the landscape, if you will. And we I couldn't use Adobe for structural reasons, so we built it out of concrete because we needed it to be structurally sound, but we've rendered it in a mud like finish, so it still looks like it's indicative of, but it's not, right? And so we did all sorts of things with the architecture to make it as contextual as we could, right? um at least the area that I had control of. And then the swimming pool, we made it bigger. So we made it 25 meters long. So it's half an Olympic size, 8 lanes wide. So it can be used competitively. So it's not just, recreational for leisure at the weekends. Lagos state schools can come and they can have their inter-house sports and, other sporting events, Olympic trials, whatever else, right? And then I knew that, okay, if we're going to do this exhibition space to international museum grade, MoMA, whoever it is, I needed the people that could do it. I needed subject matter experts, right? And as we went on, I stumbled on this book called Yoruba Art and Language, or someone actually recommended it to me, and I read it, and it articulated everything in my head. Like, and I mean, what the book basically does, it talks about, or it looks at Yoruba as a language and culture, but from a philosophical thought perspective. My team, right? I've got, yeah. So I mean, one of the things that I made sure I did was I went and got the best subject matter experts that I could. So I've got a Harvard scholar, right? I've got a Cambridge scholar who wrote the narrative for the museum, right? And then I've got two other scholars, one from Leeds and one from Wisconsin somewhere, right? And then my exhibition designers are Ralph Applebaum Associates. They've done 300 museums around the world. they did the African American Museum in Washington that was designed by David Ajaya. So I tried my best, and then my interior fabricators are a company in the UK called The Hub. So the entire interior fabrication system is being made in the UK and is being shipped down to Lagos. In fact, my containers are in Lagos at the moment. You know what I mean? So that for me, it was go in, go big, go hard, build the system from the ground up. So not just the building, but the actual operating system as well. I've got a partnership with the British Museum. So they're helping me set up operating systems, training staff, management procedures, all of that. The client has set up a board which is made up of public and private sector personnel. We're currently speaking to sponsors, and funders so that we've got a support system for this institution because there really isn't any precedent for what we're doing, right? And for me, it's important to build that system so people can see it's possible. I call it first mover disadvantage. Everybody will say it can't be done until you do it, and then they'll say, "Yeah, I knew you could do it."
Yeah, so Phil was instrumental in helping build that team because so there was this book, like, I spoke about Professor Roland Abiodun's book, Yoruba Art and Language. It's recommended must read. It really sort of opens your mind into sort of Yoruba and by extension African philosophy, and how it relates to what is now known as, say, Yoruba art and even language. The role of the orikis and even the differences in interpreting, say, African art or Yoruba art and Western art, even sort of just looking at aesthetics. So if I use that as an example, so if you take Michelangelo's David, right, which is your sort of classical Western sculpture, right, very finely chiseled, very beautiful, very proportioned, and then there was also this sort of belief that the size of your intellect was inversely proportional to the size of your gender, um, which is why Michelangelo was seen as extremely intelligent but had a very little willy. um, and because that was the aesthetic interpretation of the time.
Yeah.
Whereas if you look at Yoruba carvings of, say, a male or a female, there's more abstraction.
Yeah. And it was eyes, head.
Yeah, the
markings.
focus is on exactly because the ori is sort of your center of your being, your destiny. Yeah. So the head is seen as the most important. So if you look at the proportions, the head is almost sort of
always bigger than the body,
if not half than the body.
Yes.
And then the eyes being the window, to the soul, to the ori, are sort of prominent. And then the willy is quite also prominent because that is the point of creation, right? And then with the women, it's the heavy bosom with the big head, the big eyes, so you can see that the approach to aesthetic interpretation.
Big heads were considered beautiful. The bigger your head,
yes, the bigger your head, man, like bigger head, bigger members, bigger bosom, and so there was emphasis on those features, in Yoruba with carvings, right? So he was for me the key. Had to try and get him on, right? So we got him on, and then he insisted that we contact some associates of his. So Professor Jacob Olukwana, who is a Harvard professor of African religion, came on board. Professor Henry Drull, who's a Wisconsin-Madison professor of African art, came on board, and Professor Drull actually worked at the National Museum sometime in the 60s in Lagos. Yeah, and then Dr. Will Ree, aka, what was Real's? We gave him a Yoruba name. So Dr. Henry was Ishola, and then I think Will was Adekunle, and Will was born in Ibadan.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and Will is Leeds University professor of African art. Will is like the number one scholar / reference point on African wood carvings, man. Will can look at a carving and tell you who made it, when. Like Will is bananas. And so they were my four fonts of knowledge, so they were the nucleus, so they created the narrative, right? The intellectual base, you know for the exhibition. So the story that you walk through, they created that. And so it was about a celebration, and it was a look at the evolution of Yoruba culture from the beginning of time, using one of the Yoruba origin stories from Ifa divination corpus. So I won't give you too much detail because you have to come and look at it yourself. But yeah, so that was the intellectual base, and then from there we now started to hire curators, researchers, curatorial assistants, and then we needed script writers and translators because the entire exhibition was in Yoruba. So obviously we crafted it in English first, and then we had to translate it. So Kola Tubosun was wheeled in to carry out that exercise. And then, from translation, we needed to get it proofread to make sure, it made sense and all the amiohuns were in the right place. And yeah, it was chaotic because and then from the script, from the narrative, we now went, let's say we went to market, we now went sourcing objects that would fit that narrative. Do you get? So it wasn't back to front. So we had an opportunity because usually people have their collection, right, before they build their museum. But we were doing this back to front, which now turned into an advantage because we could be quite targeted with the objects that we needed. And so Professor Roland and Professor Henry also had their vision of what this space should be like. So, Professor Roland always said it's not a museum, it's a center, because museums are static. And Yoruba culture, by definition, is a very dynamic, constantly evolving, culture. It's, constantly moving. So how do we express that? Professor Henry, was one who insisted on that sort of soundscape. So it was surreal because it was like these four guys just came and articulated everything that was in my head, to such a high level of intellectual excellence that it just made my life and my job so much easier. And then so I was now able to sort of sit back almost at that sort of conductor of the orchestra quarterback level, and now look at it through the eyes of the end user, because I had all this sort of intellectual academic excellence, so I could pull back and say, okay, I have to make sure that this space is not too didactic. I have to make sure that there's an entertainment component, there's a nostalgic component, there's a memory, there's a sort of fabric of memory component there, right? Because the thing for me was, when you went through museum spaces, yes, they were informative, but they were almost sort of just very, very simply academic and dull, right? I wanted to create a space that was emotional, that the first person, you see it through the eyes of the first person, where they remember, they respond. So it's not just artifacts. We were very clear that we didn't want more than 25%, if up to that, of the entire exhibition to be just sort of old historical artifacts. So we wanted objects of recent past, objects of everyday, and then there was part of me that wanted to celebrate the everyday person as well as the sort of custodian of the culture. So the market woman, the granite seller, the tailor, the craftsman, the basket weaver. So it's not just your showing cars and your Herbert Ogundis and co, but the man on the street at the granular level. Because they play their part in moving the culture forward.
They are the culture.
They are the culture, effectively. So, and like, for example, that's what brought about the Tales by Moonlight section, right? So we built the tree. That was probably the one highlight, or not highlight, but it's the one part of my childhood that I remember.
Tales by Moonlight.
Yeah.
Then after Willy Willy will come on. Oh,
Willy
no.
Willy and Storyland and all of that. You get,
Yeah.
So for me, it was like, okay, how do I create sort of, not so much a visual metaphor, but some of it, realistic and visceral enough for people to have a reaction when they come into the space, right? So, we created this tree. And then, we got benches from an existing tree that we cut down and then used that to create stools in a sort of semicircle form. And then, do you remember Uncle Jimmy Sholanke?
Mm-hmm.
We found him.
Wow, you found him.
Found Uncle Jimmy, put him in the studio.
Like real life.
Real life. Put him in the studio.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And he read a number of stories for us, in
Epic.
Yoruba and English.
Epic.
Then we found an old school radiogram. You remember the old school radiogram? Like there was one in my granddad's house. Yeah, that people had in their granddad's houses.
Yes.
So we got one of those, got it off eBay.
Oh my God.
Gutted it out, put an LED plus speaker chip in it, and then recorded the sound onto that chip so that you come into the space, you press a button, and Uncle Jimmy, you just hear once upon a time. And he starts the story, or the Yoruba version, he goes "alo," and then obviously you go "alo," and then the story gets, the narrative comes through the speakers. So anyone of a certain generation recognizes Uncle Jimmy's voice. And once they hear that voice and they hear the story and the manner with which it's told, there's a visceral reaction to that. There's a very sort of strong reaction because it just sort of takes you back 30 odd years where you remember how these stories were told to you orally by either your dad, your granddad, your mom, your grandmom, sort of thing. So we've got that. Like I remember when I took my client there and I pressed the button and he just looked at me and I was like, yeah, it's him.
Oh wow. How cool.
Very cool. A few weeks ago I took Uncle Jimmy there as well. Even he was stunned. I think he was almost tearful. Because he was like, is that me? I was like, yeah, that's you, dude.
But I guess one of the questions is like being able to go back and celebrate, because there's something about the building is more than just a building, and the curation is more than just storytelling. I think it's also a celebration of the influences over time that have created
Absolutely.
what we know today as Yoruba culture, right? And being able to go back and tell that story
and tell the story
authentically is
absolutely
so beautiful. What part of this was a learning for you around being bold?
All of it. And it was, I had to be a quick study, even though it took me time. And I think when I started, I was almost apologetic, reaching out to people and saying, and I was almost begging them to buy into the vision. So maybe there was a desperation, attached with that approach, because I was reaching out to people and I was saying, this is what I'm trying to do. Can you please come on board? And it was just, nope, not interested. Who's your client? No. Are you kidding me? No. I remember someone even said to me that I can't afford to have my white stained by you.
Wow. You're crazy until you've done it, right?
Yeah. And, and that made me realize. So that was very early on. I remember someone saying to me, who are you? I've never heard of you. You're nobody.
Wow.
Like, why you even doing this? Are you just trying to use this to launder money? Are you just trying to chop? Yeah, it was awful. It was negative. It was disrespectful. And like it was a punch in the guts, man. And I remember going home just thinking, you know what? Yeah, I licked my wounds for a few days, but then I just thought, that was probably the best lesson I could have learned at that time, because it made me realize, one, how daunting this task was really going to be, and secondly, very, very, very few people actually have the foresight or the ability to think outside of their sphere of understanding. Do you get? So it made me become very, very targeted with building my team. Do you understand? Like, I didn't want any half steppers. I didn't want any sort of maybe, let me, this thing could be good, so let me come in, but I'm half in, so that once it starts to go pear-shaped,
I'm out.
I just, deuces, man, sort of thing. So it changed my approach completely. So anybody I'm coming to, I'm saying, look, man, you're either all in or not. I'm going to do this with or without you. Do you get? So yeah, I had to grow up very quickly.
Incredible. That's amazing. So your favorite buildings in Africa are?
Ooh, the National Theatre, Igomu, Lagos. That building is why I became an architect. Yeah, I went there as a 7-year-old boy, and I was done. Love. As in, I remember the off-shutter concrete. It was, they used sawn planks as shuttering for the concrete, and then they painted it white. So when you walk up to the building, you can see the grains of the wood on the concrete. I remember going there as a 7-year-old boy and losing my mind. That's my all-time fave. My dad thinks I became an architect because of him, but no, it's because of National Theatre.
What are the simple ways that you think, or that you would recommend, that we can make our homes a little bit more spectacular than they are at the moment?
Color art, and I say buildings are capsules of memory frozen in space and time, right? So they're just backdrops. So whatever you can do to uplift your space, to make you positive psychologically, so that you can have fun memories that you can draw on when you've left the space. So anything you can do to improve that backdrop, that's not a big TV, that's not really heavy curtains, So I think bright colors or muted colors and art. I think people underestimate the value of art in spaces. So I would say art.
Thank you, Seun, for another incredible episode. Hopefully this structure has been insightful, where we've woven sort of the during and now the post, and the post in the post.
Post.
Would love to have you on again, because I think the conversation around design, and I guess, everyone knows that real estate is a thing that tends to stand the test of time across centuries. But would love to sort of have you back on the show. Everyone can find you where?
Company website, www.si.sa.com.
Thank you so much, Zeze.
Thank you to over 20,000 of you that have tuned in and have continued to tune in. Because of you, our show is now distributed on Vodacom Africa's platform, My Muse. Your support helps make this show bigger and better. If you're a fan of the show, we would love to know. Please leave a review on Apple Podcasts and join our community with weekly newsletters curated just for you. Check out our free resources on entrepreneurship, productivity, finance, and leadership at thirdcultureafricans.com. You can now catch special episodes with video on YouTube at Third Culture Africans. Let's connect on Instagram and Facebook at Third Culture Africans. Let's do this.